Well, hi, everybody. It is now the top of the hour, and I figured we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar on the Revit Parameter Primer Part 2. My name is Sash Kazaminajad, and I am the Customer Success Manager with Ideate Software. Just a little bit about me. I am in Portland, Oregon. My background is in architecture, California licensed architect, and I've been with Ideate now for over 7 years. Time sure definitely does fly by. So for today's agenda, I'm going to do a really brief recap on part 1, which was last week, and then we'll talk a little bit about using linked file project parameters. So having files that have the same project parameters, and when linking, how they actually show up in the schedule as potentially one column of data instead of multiple columns of data. And we saw some multiple columns of data from last week's presentation. We'll also talk about some strategies for resolving some poorly managed parameters as well. So as everybody probably has experienced, you work in a project, you have a lot of parameters, people are filling in data in multiple columns. We really need to start cleaning some of that data up, so we're referring to one column of data, not multiple columns of data. Okay, so from the first webinar, and this is just a brief recap, we had looked at some of the reasons why you can't edit some of these fields in a schedule. So last week we looked at some ADA compliant parameters that were just yes/no parameters, and we would click in some of these fields and realize that they were not editable. Or we had some fields that were filled out with data, and we click in them and we can't edit them, and we're trying to figure out why they were not editable. Or this situation here, which I showed everybody last week, which was multiple columns with the same parameters, and why this information was not editable at all. And it's very frustrating, right? We've all run into these kinds of situations before with data that we have multiple parameters, 4, 5, 6, 7 parameters, sometimes the same data, and we're wondering where this information came from. And as we start scheduling it, we're thinking, oh, this looks like the right parameter to schedule. Oh, I see another one here, the same thing. Let's go ahead and schedule that. And the next thing you know, your schedule is absolutely confusing. So one of the things I want to point out to you is in a project, and especially if you're creating parameters in which you do not need to, let's say, have parameters that need to be tagged. So for example, you want to add some project parameters to your project. There is no need to tag this information. That's actually a great workflow, and I'm a huge fan of project parameters for these reasons. Again, if you have specific ones that you're going to be using from project to project to project, it's a great idea to add these parameters in your Revit templates. All right. Now, again, one thing to keep in mind is project parameters can be scheduled but cannot be tagged. Okay. If you need to add a project parameter that needs to be scheduled and tagged, it needs to be what we call a project shared parameter. All right, it's a little different terminology than what we're used to seeing in Revit, because Revit really just distinguishes things between project and shared parameters and family parameters. So the key thing about project parameters, especially if you're working with consultants that are also filling out similar data, is, and this is a big part of BIM execution plans and why you need to have these things in place and talk about what your Revit models are going to look like before you start modeling anything, is you can actually create project parameters with the same names and the same category assignments. And when you link in each other's models, you should be able to see that parameter data show up in the same column. That's a really big deal. That way you're not having to share a shared parameters file just so you can get the information to talk to each other. So this is something that you may want to consider looking at. The other thing to keep in mind here is you cannot, of course, edit the parameter data from any of the linked files without editing the link itself. So again, looking at instruments of service, if your consultants have data that need to be edited, always ask them to do that and get a fresh copy of the file. We don't want to be editing anybody else's files. So I'm going to immediately get into a quick demo of this, and I already have the parameters set up, but I just want to show you what it looks like when you have the same project parameters in these files and you link them in with each other. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to come over here to a mechanical file, and it should be on your screen right now. And I'm in just a schedule over here. And the parameter I'm going to focus on here is a serial number parameter. You can see I have some information filled out. Also, just to kind of point out, I have a parameter here that just kind of list the disciplines here. You can see I have architectural and plumbing. These files are basically linked into each other, but really the focus is on these serial numbers over here from this particular file. If I come over here to the edit fields and I have a look at this serial number parameter, I'm just going to come over to the edit. And when I come over to the edit, we could see clearly that this is a project parameter. And again, Revit really reminds us right here, can appear in schedules, but not in tags, okay? And again, I may not want to tag the serial number. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. All right, and we can see over here, I have the serial number. It's a text-based parameter, which allows me some freedom and flexibility to put alphanumeric characters, even smiley faces, which I was playing around with, which you don't want to do, but you certainly can. And I just grouped it under identity data so I can find the information in my properties palette. And the other key thing over here is I added it to the plumbing fixtures category right here. All right, once that was all done, once I set up this, this parameter, I came over here and I have my architectural file, which is right over here. And that mechanical file is linked into this architectural file. By the way, you notice I had 2 sessions of Revit open. I did that so I can open these linked files in 2 separate sessions so I don't have to be forced to unload one of the links. So you can see over here, I kind of have an aggregate in column E for serial number. And again, in blue is my linked file information, which was from the link I just showed you. And then over here without these colors are the, is this particular file that you see right here. And if I click on the edit fields, and I look at that same looking serial number parameter and I hit edit, we can also see that it is a project parameter and the information looks the same. Same exact name and also the same type of parameter. And technically speaking, you can actually change the parameter group on this one. It's not going to make it so the other parameter does not show up. So that's a good thing. But what's also critical is, of course, that you have that same category added as well. So we want to make sure that we're adhering to those rules. And when you adhere to those rules, when you link these models in, that information should show up in the same exact column, which is what we're seeing over here. So we didn't have to create any sort of shared parameters to share amongst the consultants and with each other. I was able to do it just by creating a project parameter and communicating that I'm creating this parameter of this category with this exact name and that my consultant should do the same. And of course, over here, include elements and links allows me to see the linked model data. So again, really easy parameter management. I'm not managing a parameters file from this. The key thing here is I don't care to tag this parameter, so why create it as a shared parameter at that point? All right, I'm going to come back over here to the presentation. Okay, let's talk about resolving some of the common data pitfalls. We all work in Revit. We run into data pitfalls really on a daily basis. So let's chat about some of these data pitfalls. So again, we talked about these uneditable family shared parameters. And again, a lot of these family shared parameters may come from manufacturers that make up their own parameters. The goal when they make it a family shared parameter is that you can schedule that parameter when that family is loaded up into your Revit model. If it's just created as a family parameter, you may recall that a family parameter cannot be scheduled nor can it be tagged. So it's mostly there to drive geometry. It may be a yes/no parameter to show something. It may be a thickness type parameter, but you don't care to schedule that. That's really a family parameter, but a family parameter allows it to be scheduled and tagged. So a couple of solutions over here. If you have loaded up a family of a particular category, let's say it is a plumbing fixture from a manufacturer, you see this uneditable family shared parameter in your model, and you're like, gosh, I really want that parameter to also apply to all of the other plumbing fixtures in my category, right? Then what you may consider doing is adding all of the elements, or adding that parameter, I should say, to all of the elements in the selected categories. What you're essentially doing is creating a project shared parameter at that point, okay? So that allows you then to say, okay, I'm going to use this parameter from this manufacturer and apply it to other components of the same category without having to create a new shared parameter or mine that shared parameter from that file and add it to your shared parameter file just so you can tag it, okay? So that's one of the great things. What you don't want to do is create another parameter of the same exact name, because now you're going to have this duplicate column issue, this duplicate parameter issue. The key thing I want to point out over here, and it's noted right here, is that editing a family that does not have this parameter inside of it, it doesn't actually add the parameter inside that family. It just creates it as a project shared parameter. So it's very much like a project parameter, but it has shared parameter capabilities, meaning I can actually build a tag if I want to and tag that information. Also, some other things to keep in mind. So we looked at some of the reasons why a field may not be editable, right? We saw family shared that may not allow me to click and edit it, right? So we have some other bits and pieces of information or reasons why this information may not be editable. Also, global parameters. If you've played around with global parameters, they are quite fascinating. I'm actually a big fan of them. Global parameters are project specific. They can be used to drive geometry, drive information, as you can kind of see over here. But that can also make it so when you're in a schedule and you click in it, you cannot edit something. So keep in mind that a global parameter could be driving that kind of behavior. So one of the things that you want to check for in terms of family or family shared parameters are not editable is that parameter actually set to read only? Meaning, did somebody use that information in a formula within the family? Okay, so that's one of the ways that that can happen. You can do this by inputting some information between quotes, or you can also have if-then statements. So for example, you could say if the value is this or between this, then report this. If the value is between this and that, report that, and so forth. And that can drive a parameter to basically lock out on you so it's not editable. And as I mentioned before, verify if a global parameter has actually been assigned to the family parameter. Again, I'm a big fan of saying I'm going to fill in one parameter value and push that data or that information to multiple families or multiple parameters within a family. That way, in one selection or one click of a button, I can change that data and push that information out. And we see usage of global parameters for visibility. For example, you can have a title block grid of your own and say, I want to turn this off wholesale with one click of a yes/no global parameter. Or I want to maybe drive certain geometry. Maybe every door to its adjacent wall shall have a minimum of 4 inches. But oops, now I changed my mind. I want to make it 6 inches. How do I move all my doors in one click of a button? That's where a global parameter can help out. So if you haven't played around with those, definitely take a look at global parameters. They are quite fun. So let's take a look at some of these examples over here in terms of uneditable family and family shared parameters, and take a look at how we can address some of these issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this file, and I'll just close this out here real quick. I'm going to open up a different file. So bear with me for 1 second while I open this up. And we'll just do this. And yes, I am opening up a central model, but since I'm the only person working on this, I'm going to give myself a pass on that. So just take a moment while this file opens. Okay, here's the file. And what I'm going to do here is come over to the schedule here in just a moment as soon as this thing loads up. Okay, so here's my plumbing fixture schedule, and it's a little bit different from the last architectural file that you saw. I've added some additional information over here, but I wanted to show you some of the bits and pieces of information and how we can address some of them. Okay, so one of the things I want to point out to you is we'll start looking at the ADA compliant column over here. And you can see it's set up as a yes/no parameter. And as I click in the other fields over here, we can see that they're not editable. And I am going to ignore the plumbing link over here, again, which is highlighted in blue. We won't be able to edit any of this data anyways. The reason being is because it's part of a link. But these other ones over here, I have no access to. And the reason why is these were actually created as family shared parameters. And if I have a look at one of these, let's just go to the edit button. And I select on ADA compliant over here. I'm going to click on this pencil. And when I look at it, I can clearly see that it is a shared parameter. And unfortunately, Revit doesn't really tell you that it's a family shared parameter. There are ways of finding this out. Like, for example, in Ideate BIMLink, we can kind of take a look at how our links are set up and get an idea whether it's a family shared or shared parameter. It just depends on how the data can be edited. But one of the ways I can kind of get a quick idea as to whether this is a family share parameter or not is, it's very grayed out over here. And that tells me that this parameter hasn't been added really to any of the categories within this particular model. And so one of the things I want to point out to you here is that it's not editable, right? And so what I'd like to do is I'd love to be able to take this and say, look, I want to apply this parameter to these other families that are in my model. But what I don't want to do is create that parameter once again. That's going to be a big disaster. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ADA compliant parameter and go to the edit. And there's a great little checkbox that they kind of put here in the corner. It says add to all elements in the selected categories. If I select this over here, it now makes this available. And what I'll do is I'm going to add it to the plumbing fixtures category. Now, keep in mind, ADA compliant could also certainly apply to other categories, right? For those of us, especially on the architectural side, that are having to deal with access compliance, there are more categories than just plumbing fixtures. But what that's going to do is this. I'm going to hit OK. And when I hit OK, take a look at what happens to column G as soon as I hit it. When I hit column G, all of a sudden this parameter becomes available for these other categories. And if I come over to manage and I come over to project parameters, ADA compliant now shows up over here. It wasn't in here prior to that. It now has become a project shared parameter. That's pretty nifty. Now, one of the things I want to show you here is this. I'm going to take this one here, which was part of the original family that had this parameter in it. And I'm going to click on highlight and model. And the reason why I'm doing this is just easy to have it selected. And we can see the ADA compliant over here. And if I click on edit family to open the family, I want to look at the parameters over here. And when I click on this, we could see the ADA compliant is in this general category right here. And again, if I go to edit, we could see it's a shared parameter. Okay, so we know that this is definitely the source of the ADA compliant data. Now, one of the things I want to do is I'm going to come back to the schedule and pick on another family where this wasn't a source. It's now available to check. You can see over here, I can now actually append this data. And I'm going to come to highlight and model. And we'll just pick this particular sync over here. And we can see ADA compliant is available. Watch what happens when I hit edit family. When I hit edit family and I come over to the family types, ADA compliant is not available over here. So it did not go into the family and add that parameter to the family. It made it a project shared parameter. Okay, that's all it did. So keep in mind that when you do that, it's not opening the family, adding the parameter, closing it, reloading it. It's just making it really a project parameter, but a project shared parameter. So again, I don't need to create these parameters over and over. I can easily do this. So I'm using somebody else's parameter and saying, you know what, the heck with it. I'm going to add it to this project while I'm here. For these particular ones over here, if these need to be ADA compliant, you'll have to open up the link model and basically repeat the same process in order to get that same parameter to show up in the link as well. Okay, now let's take a look at the manufacturer column over here. I want to talk about a couple of these other ones over here where I'm clicking in here and I cannot edit any of this data. And you can click as hard as you want. It's not going to edit the data. Okay, so double, triple, quadruple click, try your best. However, when I click in here, I can see I can actually click and edit this information, but for some reason I cannot edit this. So let's take a look at the reason why. One of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this over here and I'm going to highlight it in model. It's the same kind of situation over here. And when I highlight it in model and I go to edit type, I'm looking at this parameter right here, the manufacturer. And this is actually a system parameter that ships with Revit. Okay. By the way, take note, I put a smiley face in here. Don't do that. Again, that could probably affect your formulas, but just the fact that Revit allows me to put smiley faces in there could be a good or bad thing. Unfortunately, I cannot click and edit this information, and that was very evident when I was in a schedule. So there's not a whole lot that I can do over here. So what I am going to do is I am going to click on Edit Family. And when I go to Edit Family, I'm going to come back to what we were just looking at over here. Obviously, we were focused on the ADA compliant earlier. But now what I want to point out to you is that this information was put in here using quotations. And when you do that, it basically hard codes it for that family. Now, keep in mind that if I had multiple types in here, So let's say it was a door family that had multiple sizes. You can't just use something like this if each one of the types has different information. You may have to use if-then formulas, or you may have to come into this field and manually edit it for each of the types. But I'm just saying, hey, you know what? This entire family and all of its types are being driven by whatever I'm putting in here, okay? So that's one of the ways that this information could be hard-coded in my Revit model, just by simply using a formula. And I encourage you to kind of play around with it. And yes, technically speaking, under the formula column, even text like this is part of a formula. All right. Now, if I come over here and say, hey, this is being driven by a global parameter, let's take a look at that. If I have this selected and I go to edit type, over here, I could say, okay, this family is being driven by a global parameter, but the difference is there's a little equal sign over here. And if I click on this equal sign over here, I could see there's something called manufacturer. It doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. However, if I come over here and go to manage, and I come to global parameters, there's the text called manufacturer, and there's the value. And again, I hard-coded that value in there, which I didn't need to necessarily do by using the same kind of formula as before. I could certainly wipe this out and make this editable and say this is somewhat editable, right? And I say somewhat because what I'm getting at is when I come back over here and hit OK, and I come back and hit edit type, it's somewhat editable because, again, I can't just edit it right here. I have to go back and edit it at the global parameter side of things. So that is going to force me to come up to manage global parameters and edit that information there. All right. So I kind of wanted to kind of point that out to you. Okay, what else do I want to show you in this example over here? We're going to come back to this serial number here in just a moment. Okay, so come back to the slide deck here. And let's talk about some of the duplicate parameters, right? So this was kind of what I had shown everybody in the last presentation. I think I had about 3 ADA compliant parameters. And that's kind of not uncommon sometimes to have multiples. And again, most of these probably come from manufacturers that make their own family shared parameters. And as you load them up, this stuff starts showing up. The reality is, and I always try to encourage people of this advice, never just load up a family from some third-party source without going through it first, meaning open up a brand new file using your template, go through there, open up the files, clean it up, remove the information you don't need, right? And maybe you need to add some of your own parameters and your own data to it before you load it up into your project. So always encourage folks, please do not just load up content without scrubbing it first. And that's especially the case if it's older content and needs to be upgraded to a newer version of Revit. This is the time to take care of all of that. Spend the extra 5 minutes so you're not spending many hours on the back end cleaning up a mess. So, you know, how do we deal with some of this duplicate parameter data? There really are a few ways that you can deal with it. I'm not really a big fan of option number 1 here, which is, you know, pick one and hide the other. You still have that information there, and people could still actually fill in that parameter on accident, and it may not even be scheduled at that point. That's not a good thing, right? So people may see that information in the properties palette in whatever view they're in, and they may say, oh, I'm going to fill in this ADA compliant, not knowing that that particular parameter isn't even scheduled because it was hidden, and instead the other ADA compliant parameter was used, right? So we want to watch out for that. The other option here is to delete one and keep the other. That's going to be a much more preferred way of doing this. But before you just delete it, you have to be aware of if you delete a parameter, you're going to lose the data. So what you're going to want to do is copy that data over into your parameter that you want to keep. And then when you feel good about it, you can wipe out that parameter that you don't want anymore. The other thing too is, and you saw this with my ADA compliant, this was a family shared parameter. The manufacturer surely didn't give me the parameter file. You can sometimes go back on their website and say, hey, where is this parameter? I need it. You actually don't need it. What you can actually do when you run into a family shared parameter is there's an option to export this parameter. And what that's going to do is it's going to write it to your parameters file in its own category called exported parameters, which I think is great. And the reason why is you can go back afterwards and move that parameter to a different category. I do not want to keep them in the exported parameters because it's not really organized at that point, but it helps me discover which are my parameters and which ones I exported out. And so what I'm going to do here for the kind of the final demonstrations, I'm going to demonstrate how to export those parameters and then how to basically take this parameter information and copy it over to your new parameter using BIMLink. So I'm going to come back to this Revit file, and what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the serial number and manufacturer serial number information. So one of the things I want to point out to you is I like this manufacturer serial number. I don't know why, but for some reason I like it. And it's the same problem that I had with the ADA compliant. This is a family shared parameter. I can clearly click in here and edit that, but for here I cannot. So like the ADA compliant, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the fields and hit edit, and I'm going to take this manufacturer serial number and I'm going to look at the parameter. And again, looks just like the ADA compliant. It wasn't added to all the elements in the selected categories. And so what I'm going to want to do here is I'm going to want to add this information over to the plumbing fixtures. So let's just go ahead and do that. All right. And so now it's available for me to edit. Okay. And let's take a look over here. Let's see what happened with my parameters file. One thing here I want to check is my shared parameters. Okay. So I do not have a parameters file. Notice over here, when I click on manufacturer serial number, the export button is grayed out. This is a great lesson right here. And the reason why is I don't have a parameters file to write to. Okay. So easy fix. I come over here to my shared parameters and it tells me right here, hey, this doesn't exist. I say, no problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new parameters file. So let me just go ahead and just call it parameters. All right, and I'm going to hit OK. So now when I hit share parameters, this pops up. Now that I've done that, if I come back to fields and I hit manufacturer serial number and I hit edit parameter, take a look at what's available. The export button. Now I have something to write to. So what I want to do is, in addition to adding this to all the categories, I also want, of the plumbing fixtures, I should say, what I want to do is export it. And this is what I was showing you earlier. It writes it to its own parameter group called exported parameters. That's awesome. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to hit OK. Because now I can actually use this, this parameter if I want to create a tag later on. This is actually a project shared parameter. Okay, it's not, even though it's a shared parameter in the sense that it's inside of a family, it's still a project shared parameter like the ADA compliant. But what I could do is I could actually build a tag now and use that parameter because I exported it out. And real quickly, immediately just go to the shared parameters here. There it is. I can now, you know, put this information in its new category. So I can make a new group over here if I want to and call it, you know, general, you know, data, right? General data. And I can certainly then come over here and say, okay, take this parameter and I can move this parameter to the general data so it's no longer in my exported parameters. Okay, I could certainly do this if I want to. That's part of the whole parameter management. But now what I've decided is we are not going to use the information here from column E. Instead, I want this information into column F. Okay, what I don't want to do, the worst thing you could do is come over here and say, gone. I'm going to remove this, because when you do this, you're going to lose all that data, and the undo button may or may not be available for you to use. And so what I want to do instead is I want to copy this information over to column F. So I would come over here and try to copy it to the clipboard. That's not going to work. So in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to use BIMLink to help out with this process. So I'll just launch BIMLink. This process will only just take a couple of minutes here. I'm going to come to new. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my schedule because I already have it. So why create it new when I can just use my schedule? And I'm interested in this case with the instance parameters because that's what these are. So I'll come over here to next. Okay. And then what I'm going to do here is just take a quick look. And if I show full preview, you could see over here that everything in white is editable. And by the way, take a look over here, and I kind of mentioned this in part one. This hatching over here represents it's from a link, meaning I can't edit this data. We can still show you information, but you can't edit it, right? And this information over here is grayed out, even though actually the reason why this is grayed out is twofold. Number one, it's a type-based parameter, and this is an instance-based link. But number two, it's also driven by a formula or also by a global parameter. So I can't just edit this information. So when you look at BIMLink, we do kind of code it so that you can understand exactly what's going on with your data. Revit doesn't do a good job of that. So I'm going to hit done, and I'm going to export this, and I'm just going to export it right here, and I'm going to open up this file. So we'll go ahead and let Excel launch, and here it is. And again, really simple example, but what I'm really interested to do is taking this data from column F, which I'm going to eventually delete in my Revit model. I'll copy it to the clipboard, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste the values. And notice I overwrote the serial numbers over there because I needed to actually input that information. In addition, while I'm here, I'll just go ahead and make these ADA compliant while I'm at it by just making these true. And take a look at this. I could come over here while I'm at it and say these are all ADA compliant, even though some of these are not. So maybe what I'll do is make this false. Why not? So these are not ADA compliant, but the rest of these are ADA compliant. So you can see once again what I can fill in. Now that I'm done, I'll close this. I'll come to import. I'll pick the plumbing fixture schedule over here. All right, and again, oh, I misspelled it. You see that right there? It helps to spell it right. So again, we're not going to error out the entire link. We're just going to error out on that one cell. That's okay. I'll just leave it the way it is. But you can see everything in here. It's changed in yellow. I'll import it. And just like that, I've now moved this data over to here. Okay. Now, again, for this one, the manufacturer, we will have to go back to the link model or ask our consultants to do the same thing that I've done over here. And then this information will show up. But now what I could do with confidence is come over here and say, I do not need this parameter anymore. I'm going to remove it. That's that warning that Revit tells you. And when I do that, I'm now focused on just one parameter or one column of data, and that's it. And you can see over here, I was able to turn on these true false by adding that information within my schedule or within my Excel file. All right, so that's a little bit of information on copying that data over. So Richard, any questions that we can answer? It looks like it was pretty quiet in the queue.
It was fairly quiet, but I did think that Robert had a good question. I think the reason being is he has a project shared parameter in his linked file, and he wants to be able to filter by that in his parent file, but it's not recognizing it. But I'm thinking he didn't do the little tick mark that checked for the categories is what I'm maybe assuming.
Okay, so let's see if we can figure that there is, if you want to filter by that parameter, I believe what has to happen in this particular example is under the filter tab, notice over here that I have the manufacturer serial number. Let me just step back a moment. Let me just undo to get the serial number in here. If I come back over here, see, I can filter on that, but one of the things that you can actually do with a shared parameter, so for example, I believe if I come to serial number, take a look over here. You can kind of see the general information over here. If it's a shared parameter, notice there is a parameter exists category. See that right there? There's a parameter exists. But if I come back to the project parameter, which was how the serial number was created, it does not actually have any value in there. So what you may want to look at in this case is if that parameter is not in your project, you may need to add that parameter to your project in order to filter on the situation here where the parameter does exist. And notice over here, there's nothing to fill in over here. Revit removes that because it's literally just the parameter exists. There's no parameter does not exist. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. Now, he's coming back and saying, but actually the linked file has a data in the project parameter in the host file. I want to filter. He wants to filter in a view, not in a schedule. Yeah. So part of the problem is in a lot of cases, Revit's filtering is different between a schedule and a view filter. And so that parameter information may not actually exist in a view. So that's always a fun thing to deal with. So if I come back over here and I go to visibility graphics and I come to filters over here, and let me just go to edit new. Again, a lot of these, like if I come over to, let's just take a look over here at plumbing fixtures. Let's just do this, plumbing fixtures. All rules must be true. Actually, let me make a new one here. Excuse me. All right, so let's call this plumbing fixtures. See what this looks like. Okay, so there's my plumbing fixtures. It's going to be part of the plumbing fixture category right here. And all elements must be true. Oh, in this case, it's completely. Oh, and maybe I need to add a. Oh, here we go. There we go. So plumbing fixtures. Now we got to look at these. This category right here. Manufacturer serial number. There is a parameter exist over here. You see that right there. So the parameter exists here. But again, if it's from a linked file and you don't have that parameter added to your current project file that it's linked into, you need to add that shared parameter to your project file in order to do your filtering based on this parameter exists. So again, some scheduled data and view filter data do not share information with each other. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind. But in this case, we could see here the manufacturer parameter exists does actually show up here. If I come back and look at the serial number, which was my original project parameter, when I come over here, there is nothing about the parameter exists. So try making that as a project shared parameter and see if that works. So try exporting that information out, or do what I did in the schedule. When you link in their model and you see these plumbing fixtures show up and you see that parameter actually show up in your list, try taking this and try adding this to the categories and then see if that parameter does exist, which it should. And the reason why is I never loaded this parameter up separately in the file. I added it as a project share parameter after the fact. And then when I do come over to the filter and I do pick this one over here, the parameter exists does work. Okay, so hopefully that helps out.
Yeah, there probably are a number of steps, and it's easy to miss a step in that process. And
absolutely.
And I also wanted to point out, since you mentioned it, Sash, that as you said, the filters for the views are very different than the filtering available for the schedule within Revit. And in fact, with Ideate BIMLink, we expand on the sort of capabilities of what you can filter and sort by. So if you don't have that availability within the schedule, you have much more exactly information that you can filter on within Ideate BIMLink.
That's the thing, like what Richard's saying, and you read my mind. It's, we build a much greater multi-category as an example, and also filter lists. And same thing with the properties, you can get other bits and pieces of information, and then you could use that as also part of your filter. For example, model group name, probably not going to get anything to show up over here because these probably don't belong to any model groups, right? But we could actually get that information where Revit's not going to let me schedule that. Hey, take a look at over here. I do have some stuff in a group. It's just families I wasn't actually focusing on, right? But the nice thing about that is then I can start using some of these parameters if I want to as part of my filter, where Revit does not actually give you this availability. So unfortunately, we can't pass this into the Revit model and do filtering using Ideate BIMLink, but we can filter out our data that we take out. So awesome. Well, that will go ahead and conclude this webinar. So again, feel free to ask questions in the survey. Please fill out the survey when you are done, when you close out of the webinar. It only takes about 1 minute. We definitely want to hear from you. If you do have questions you want us to follow up on, that's a great opportunity to do so. And so with that said, we'll go ahead and hang out here for a couple more minutes. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope you learned some new things today. And we always appreciate your continued support and continued attendance. Richard, thank you for your help as well.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Sash.
Thank you, sir.